There's a thing I never told anyone for years. Not because it was a secret exactly. More because I wasn't sure people would believe me. You tell someone a story about a guard who never moves and a little girl and a signal made of 3 small taps, and they look at you like you've had one sherry too many. But I saw it. I saw the whole thing start to finish, from a spot most people never even notice. Let me start where it started. I used to sell flowers near the palace. Not right at the gates, mind you. They'd never allow that. I had a little stand just down the way, near a corner where the tourists slowed down to take their photographs. 19 years I stood there. Rain, sun, the freezing mornings where your fingers go white around the stems. I knew that pavement better than I knew my own kitchen. And when you stand in one place for 19 years, you start to see things other people miss. You learn the rhythm of a city. You learn which buses are always late. You learn that the man who sells the newspapers coughs the same cough every winter. And you learn the guards. Most people think the guards are statues. They walk up, they wave a hand in front of a face, they shout something stupid, they take a photo, and they move on. They never look twice, but I looked. For 19 years I looked. And I'll tell you something for nothing, those men are not statues, not even close. You can tell when one of them is tired. You can tell when one's had a row at home, because his jaw sits different. You can tell which ones are new, because the new ones blink too much and you can see them fighting it. And you can tell, after a while, which ones have got a kindness in them and which ones are just doing the job. The one I'm going to tell you about, I'll call him by his first name, because that's all I ever really knew him by, and even that I learned by accident. Daniel. Daniel was tall. They're all tall, but he was tall in a way that made the bearskin look almost too small for him. Big shoulders, hands like dinner plates. The first time I noticed him properly, it was a gray morning in early spring, the kind where the sky can't decide if it's going to rain or just sulk all day. The tourists were thin on the ground. And he was stood there, perfectly still, perfectly correct, water beading on the front of his tunic, and a pigeon had landed right on the toe of his boot. Now a pigeon on your boot, that's a test. I've watched grown men twitch. I've watched them shoo it with a tiny shuffle they think nobody sees. But Daniel didn't move, not a flicker. That bird sat there for a good 2 minutes having a proper rest, and Daniel stared straight ahead like it wasn't there at all. And then this is the bit I remember. When the pigeon finally lifted off, his eyes flicked down at the boot for just a half second, just to check it, and the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, less than a smile, just the ghost of one. Then it was gone and he was a statue again. That's when I thought, there's a real person in there. There's a whole man behind that face, holding it all in. I didn't know yet how much I'd come to learn about him. I didn't know about the little girl. That came later. It must have been a few weeks after the pigeon morning. The weather had turned proper warm finally, and the crowds had thickened up the way they do. You get the coach parties then. Big groups, all following somebody holding an umbrella up in the air so nobody gets lost. Lots of noise, lots of jostling. The pavements get tight. I had a good day going. Sold a fair few bunches. And I was tying off a bundle of those little white roses, the ones that go brown if you so much as breathe on them wrong, when I noticed a different sort of group near the railings. Not tourists. You can always tell. Tourists move slow and look up. This group moved careful and looked sideways. 2 large men in plain suits, walking the way men walk when they're not really looking at anything but seeing everything. And between them, a woman in a green coat holding the hand of a small child. The child couldn't have been more than 5, maybe 6. Little coat, little shoes that buckled, hair done up neat with a clip in it, and she was dragging her feet, not in a naughty way, in a frightened way. You could see it in her shoulders. They were up around her ears. I didn't think much of it at first. Children get tired. Children get scared of crowds. Happens all the time. I've seen 1,000 little ones have a wobble outside those gates because there's too many people and too much noise, and the men in the big black hats look like giants out of a storybook. But this little girl wasn't crying. That's what got me. She wasn't making a fuss. She was just gone very, very quiet, the way some children do when they're frightened deep down. The quiet ones are the ones to watch. The loud ones are just letting it out. The quiet ones are holding it in, and holding it in is harder. The woman in the green coat crouched down and said something to her. I couldn't hear it over the crowd. The little girl shook her head. And then one of the suited men checked his watch and they moved on, towards the side, away from the thickest part of the crowd. And as they passed near the sentry box near Daniel, I saw the little girl look up, right up at him. All that height, all that black fur and red and gold, and she just stared. And Daniel, I swear this is true, Daniel did the thing with his eyes, the flick, the half second. He looked down at her, and the corner of his mouth did that ghost of a smile, the same one I'd seen the pigeon get. The little girl didn't smile back. She just kept staring, the way children do when they're working something out. And then the green coat moved her along and they were gone round the corner, and that was that. I went home that night and didn't think about it. Why would I? A child looked at a guard, the most ordinary thing in the world. But she came back. It was about a week later, same sort of arrangement. The two men, the woman in the coat, though it was a different coat this time, a navy one, and the little girl. They came at a quiet hour, mid-morning, before the big coach crowds, and I understood then that this was deliberate. They came when it was calm. Somebody had worked out that the calm hours were better for her. And I watched, because by now I was curious, the way you get curious about a thing you've half noticed twice. The little girl walked a bit closer to the railings this time, still holding the woman's hand but not dragging, and when she came level with Daniel's box, she stopped. Just stopped dead. The woman gave a little tug and then thought better of it and let her stand. And the little girl looked up at Daniel. And Daniel looked straight ahead because that's the rule, that's the whole job, you look ahead and you do not engage. He couldn't crouch down and chat to her. He couldn't wave. There's men whose whole purpose is to make sure he doesn't. He's on duty. He's part of something bigger than himself, and the stillness is the point of it. But, while he was staring straight ahead, off into the middle distance, with this small, frightened child gazing up at him, his right hand down by his side did something. I almost missed it. If I hadn't been watching for it, I'd never have seen. His fingers, which had been flat and straight against the seam of his trousers the way they're meant to be, curled in slow, made a loose fist. And then the thumb came up just slightly and tapped against the side of his finger. Once, twice, a third time, 3 little taps. Then his hand went flat again, straight, correct, like nothing had happened. And the little girl, she watched his hand. Her eyes went down to it and then back up to his face, and I watched the whole frightened set of her little shoulders come down about an inch. Just an inch. But an inch is everything on a child who's holding it all in. I didn't understand it. Of course I didn't. To me it just looked like a man fidgeting and a child noticing. But there was something in the way she settled, something in the way he did it, so careful, so private, that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The woman in the navy coat hadn't seen it. The suited men hadn't seen it. Nobody had seen it but me, and I only saw it because I'd given 19 years of my life to standing in one place and watching. They moved on after a minute. The little girl walked a bit straighter, and as she went past she did a thing that I'll remember till the day I die. She looked back over her shoulder at Daniel and she lifted her own little hand, and she made a fist, and the thumb came up, and she tapped, once, twice, a third time. Daniel didn't move, couldn't, but that ghost of a smile, it was there, bigger than I'd ever seen it, and then it was gone and the child was gone and he was a statue again. Watching the empty middle distance with water-clear discipline. I stood there with a bunch of white roses going soft in my hand, and I thought, what on earth did I just see? Now, I want to be honest with you about something, because I've thought about this a lot over the years and I want to tell it straight. I didn't know who the little girl was, not properly. I had my guesses like anyone would, given the men in suits and the careful way they moved her about. But I never asked, and nobody ever told me, and I'm not going to dress it up now and pretend I had more than I did. She was a small girl from a household where the children are kept close and kept careful. That's all I'll say, and that's all I knew. What I did know, what I could see plain as day, was that she was frightened. Frightened of the crowds, frightened of the noise, frightened in that quiet lockdown way that the careful children get. And I knew that a guard, a man whose entire job is to not move, to not engage, to give nothing, had found a way to reach her anyway. I started looking forward to them coming. Is that a strange thing to admit? I'd be tying my bunches in the morning and I'd find myself glancing up the road, hopping. And maybe once a week, sometimes less, they'd appear in the quiet hours. Different coats on the woman, always those same two suited men or men like them, and the little girl in her buckle shoes. And every time, every single time, she'd stop at Daniel's box, and his hand would curl and the thumb would tap 3 times, low and private and quick, and she'd settle. And sometimes she'd tap back, and sometimes she was too shy and just watched, but the settling always happened. You could set your watch by it. I started to think of it as theirs. A little thing that belonged to the two of them, passed back and forth in plain sight, in the middle of the biggest crowds in the country, and nobody knowing but a flower seller who'd learned to look. I didn't know yet what the 3 taps meant. I thought, for the longest time, that it was just a hello. A secret hello between a giant in a fur hat and a frightened little girl. A way of saying, I see you, I'm here, you're all right. I was half right. It was more than a hello. I'd find that out. But it took something happening, something I still don't like to think about, before I understood the whole of it. Let me tell you about the man a bit more, because I think it matters. I never spoke to Daniel on duty. You can't, and I wouldn't have dreamed of it. But I saw him off duty twice, and both times by chance. The first time I'd packed up early bad chest that winter and I was waiting for my bus, and a young man came and stood at the same stop in jeans and a jacket with a kit bag over his shoulder. Took me a minute. Then I clocked the shoulders, the height, the way he stood, even in civvies, like there was a string pulling him up from the top of his head. I said, "You're one of the guards, aren't you, up at the palace?" He looked a bit startled, then he sort of smiled and said, "How'd you know that?" "I sell the flowers," I said. "Down the road, I've watched you stand there in the rain." And he laughed a proper laugh and said, "The flower lady, we see you and all, you know. We're not allowed to look, but we see everything." And then quieter, it helps, having something normal to look at. When you're stood there for hours, you'd be surprised. I never forgot that. We're not allowed to look, but we see everything. That's the whole of it, isn't it? That's the whole of what those men carry. The second time I saw him off duty, it was years later, and that's a different part of the story, and I'll come to it. But I tell you about the bus stop because I want you to understand he wasn't a statue. He wasn't a storybook giant. He was a young man with a kit bag and a bad weather smile who liked having something normal to look at. He had a mum somewhere. He had a life. He'd chosen this strange, still, demanding job where the whole point is that you disappear into it, where your face becomes part of the building, where 10,000 people a day treat you like furniture. And inside all that stillness, he'd found one frightened little girl, and he'd decided, quietly on his own, breaking no rule that I could ever see, that she was worth 3 small taps of his thumb. I think about that a lot. The size of a small kindness, done by a man who wasn't supposed to do anything at all. I should tell you about the day it changed, or started to. It was high summer, proper crowds, the kind of day where the heat comes up off the pavement and you can taste the diesel and the sun cream and the hot fur of all those bearskins. The kind of day where the tourists go a bit mad and forget their manners. The little girl came at the wrong time. That's the thing I noticed first. They came not in the quiet hour but right in the thick of it, the middle of the day, and I remember thinking, that's not right, that's not how they do it. And the woman with her, a third one I hadn't seen, older, more flustered, looked like she hadn't planned to be there at all. like something had gone wrong with the day and they'd ended up in the crush by accident. There was only one suited man with them that day, just the one, and he was on his phone, half turned away, frowning at something, the way you do when a plan's fallen apart and you're trying to fix it on the hoof. And the little girl was in the middle of all those legs and bags and elbows in a sundress, holding the older woman's hand. And the crowd was pressing, and I could see, even from where I stood, that her shoulders had gone right up round her ears again, higher than I'd ever seen them. She'd gone that deep, locked, frightened quiet. I felt it in my stomach before anything happened. You know that feeling, when the air goes wrong, when the crowd's mood shifts and you can't say why, but every part of you says something's about to go. And the little girl turned her head, searching, the way a frightened child searches for the one safe thing, and she found Daniel's box. And she started trying to get to it. I'll tell you the rest, but I have to tell it proper and slow, and there's more to it than I've said, so I'm going to take a breath here. Because what happened next is the reason I never forgot any of this. It's the reason I'm telling you at all. It's the day I found out what the 3 taps really meant. I left you in the crush of that summer day, with the little girl trying to fight her way to Daniel's box. I'm going to leave her there a moment longer. I know that's a cruel thing to do, but I can't tell you what that moment meant unless you understand what came before it. Unless you understand how the 3 taps came to be in the first place. So let me go back. Let me tell you how he taught her. Because I worked it out in the end. Not all at once. In pieces over a spring and a summer, the way you work out anything you watch closely enough. It didn't start with 3 taps. It started with stillness. The first few times the little girl came, those early visits I told you about, Daniel didn't do anything at all. He just stood. But I noticed she was drawn to him. Out of all the guards, all the boxes, all the giants in their fur hats, it was his she went to. And I think I know why. There are guards who, when a child stares at them, you can feel them go tense. They don't want it. The looking unsettles them, makes the stillness harder, and the children feel that the way children feel everything, and they back away. Daniel wasn't like that. When she looked at him, he got softer somehow, without moving a muscle. I can't explain it better than that. The stillness in him went from a wall to a shelter, and she felt the difference. Children always do. So she kept coming back to him, and he kept being a shelter. Then came the taps, and I think I've thought about this for years. I think the taps started because of something that frightened her. It was a windy day early on. One of those gusty spring afternoons where the air's full of grit and bits of paper, and somebody's umbrella turned inside out near the railings with a great bang and a snap. And the little girl jumped. Properly jumped, the way nervous children do, the whole body. And she grabbed the woman's coat and buried her face in it. And Daniel, without turning his head, without breaking his eyes off the middle distance, brought his hand down by his side and curled it and tapped his thumb against his fingers. Slow, deliberate, loud enough, I think, that even buried in a coat a child might catch the rhythm of it if she peeked. And she did peek, one eye out of the coat, and she watched his hand do the 3 taps. Slow, steady, tap, tap, tap. And there was something so calm about it, so unhurried, while everyone else was clutching their flapping umbrellas and grabbing their hats. Here was this enormous still man, tapping out a slow little rhythm with his thumb, like the wind was nothing, like the bang was nothing, like the whole world could blow itself inside out, and he'd just keep tapping, calm as you like. The little girl came out of the coat, watched him finish, and then, and I nearly dropped my flowers, she copied him, made her own little fist, tapped her own little thumb. Slow, tap, 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 matching him. And the fright went out of her, just like that. That's when I understood the first thing about it. It wasn't a hello, it was a steadying. He'd given her something to do with her hands when she was frightened, something slow and rhythmic to copy, to pull her out of the panic and into the rhythm. The way you might teach a child to take 3 deep breaths. Only he couldn't speak, and he couldn't crouch down, and he couldn't put an arm round her. All he had was his hand and 3 taps, so that's what he gave her. When you're frightened, the taps said, do this with me. Slow 3 times and the fright will pass. I've thought since that it's the cleverest, kindest bit of teaching I ever saw, and not one word of it was ever spoken. Now here's where it got more than that. Here's where it became a proper signal with proper meaning, the way the title of this story promises you, a secret signal for danger, because it didn't stay a steadying thing. It grew. There was a visit high spring blossom everywhere, a good crowd but a happy one where I saw the little girl do the taps first, before she was frightened. She walked up to Daniel's box, bold as anything that day, and she stopped, and she made her fist and tapped 3 times, looking up at him, asking him almost, "Are you there? Is it you?" And he tapped back, "3 times, I'm here." And then, and this was new, she did something different. She tapped fast. Lots of little taps, quick, not the slow, steady 3, and she watched his face to see what he'd do. And Daniel didn't tap back the fast version. He very deliberately did the slow one. Tap, 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 as if to say, no, we do it slow. Slow is the one. Slow is for when it matters. I realized they were building a language. The two of them. Right there in front of the crowds. A giant who wasn't allowed to move and a little girl who was learning what the world was. They were building a private language out of a thumb and a few fingers, and they were sorting out the grammar of it as they went. Slow 3 taps, I'm here. You're safe, steady. And I can't prove this, but I think that somewhere in all those visits, the slow 3 taps got a second meaning, a graver one, because of the way she started using it. There was a day a man got too loud near the railings. A tourist, drunk maybe, or just an idiot shouting and laughing and getting too close to the guards, doing the stupid thing where they try to make a guard react. Security moved him on quick enough. But while it was happening, while the man was barking and lunging about, the little girl had gone rigid with fright and she'd looked to Daniel and she'd done the 3 taps but urgently, pressing her thumb hard, doing it again and again. Tap, 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 tap. And Daniel did something he'd never done before. While the drunk man was being walked away, Daniel's eyes, just for a second, went off the middle distance and onto the little girl. Direct. A real look. And he gave her one slow, firm, exaggerated 3 taps. And then his hand went flat and his eyes went front and he was a statue again. But in that 1 second of real eye contact, something had passed between them. I read it as clear as if he'd shouted it across the courtyard. I see it. I see the trouble. I've got it. You're all right. That's when the steadying became a signal. That's when 3 taps stopped meaning only be calm and started also meaning something's wrong and I see it. A child could send it. I'm scared, something's wrong, are you watching? And he could send it back. I'm watching. I've got you. It was an emergency signal. A real one. Built by a little girl and a guard in plain sight out of nothing but a thumb. And I was the only one who knew it existed. I want to stop here and tell you about the woman in the coats, the minders, because I've made it sound like nobody but me ever saw any of this, and that's not quite fair, and I want to be honest. The woman, there were a few of them, but there was one in particular, the navy coat one, who I came to think was the regular. She wasn't a fool. You don't get given the care of a child like that if you're a fool. And I think, towards the end of that spring, she'd half noticed something too. Because there was a day she watched. While the little girl did the taps and Daniel tapped back, the navy coat woman stood very still and watched the child's hand, and then watched the guard's hand, and I saw the understanding cross her face. Just for a moment. A little frown, then a softening. And she didn't stop it. She didn't pull the child away or report the guard for breaking his stillness or any of the things she might have done. She let it be. She let the child have it. I've always loved her for that, whoever she was, because she could have ended it. A word in the right ear and Daniel would have been moved, posted elsewhere, told off for engaging. The rules are the rules and they exist for good reasons. A guard who reacts to children is a guard who can be tricked, distracted, used. There's danger in it. The minder would have known all that better than I did. But she'd also have known what I knew, that the child was frightened, deep down frightened, the lock quiet kind, and that this enormous still man had found the one thing in all of London that made the fright go out of her shoulders. And she made a choice. She decided the small risk of a broken rule was worth the great gift of a frightened child learning she could be brave. I don't think Daniel ever knew the minder had clocked it. I think he believed it was secret, and maybe it was better that way. But I always reckoned there were 3 people guarding that little girl on those mornings, not 2. The suited men and the minder and Daniel. And of the 3, I'm not sure Daniel wasn't the one she trusted most. So, now you know. Now you understand what the 3 taps were, and where they came from, and why a little girl in the middle of a summer crush would fight through a forest of legs to reach a guard's box. Let me take you back to that day. It was the wrong time, like I said. The middle of the day, the thickest of the crowds, and only one suited man, and he was turned away on his phone with a plan falling apart in his ear. The little girl was holding an older woman's hand, a flustered woman I hadn't seen before, and the crowd was pressing in, and the air had gone wrong, that thick stomach-dropping wrongness that you feel before you understand it. Here's what I think had happened, and again, I'm telling you straight, this is my guess and not gospel. I think there'd been a change of plan that morning. Somewhere they were meant to be, they couldn't be. Somewhere they were meant to go was shut or moved, or it had gone wrong some way that grown-ups' plans go wrong. And so they'd ended up out in the open in the crowd at exactly the time they always took such care to avoid. The careful arrangements had slipped, the way arrangements do, and a frightened little girl had been brought into the one situation that frightened her most. And she'd gone rigid, shoulders to her ears, that deep locked silence. And then the crowd surged. I don't know what started it. Maybe a coach had pulled up. Maybe the guard change was about to happen and everyone moved at once to get a spot. It doesn't take much. With a crowd that size, one push at the back ripples all the way to the front. And suddenly everyone's pressed tight and shuffling, and the children and the small folk get swallowed up in it. And the little girl's hand came out of the older woman's hand. I saw it happen. I saw the gap open between them. The older woman turned, grabbed, missed. A man with a rucksack had stepped between them, oblivious, just a big oblivious man with a camera. And for a moment, a terrible moment, the little girl was alone. Alone in the legs and the bags and the heat and the noise. A tiny thing in a sundress in a sea of strangers. And the suited man still turned away on his phone. And the older woman swallowed up behind the rucksack, calling a name I couldn't hear over the din. And the little girl did the only thing she knew to do. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She'd never been a child who let it out. She held it in the way she always had. And she turned her frightened little face towards the one safe thing in the whole of London. She found Daniel's box. And she lifted her hand, and over the heads of the crowd. Through a gap that opened and closed in the press of bodies, she made her fist, and her thumb came up, and she tapped. Not slow, not the steady 3. Fast and hard and again and again. Tap, 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 tap. The emergency, the real one. The one they'd built for exactly this and prayed they'd never need. Something's wrong, I'm scared. Are you watching? Please be watching. And I turned to look at Daniel, my heart in my mouth, my flowers forgotten in my hands. And what he did next, a man who is not allowed to move, not allowed to look, not allowed to leave his post for any reason, a man whose entire sworn duty in that moment was to stand perfectly still no matter what he did next is the reason I am telling you this story at all. Here is what Daniel did. And I want you to remember as I tell you exactly what the job is. The job is to not move. The job is to stand your post no matter what. There are stories, true ones, of guards standing through feints and heat, and people screaming abuse an inch from their faces, and they do not move, because the moving is the one thing they must never do. The stillness is the whole sworn point of them. So when I tell you Daniel saw that little girl alone in the crowd, frantically tapping out the emergency they'd built together, and did not run to her, I don't want you to think for 1 second that he failed her. He did the opposite. He stood his post, and in standing it he saved her. Let me tell you how. The first thing he did I almost missed because it was so small. His eyes, which by all the rules should have stayed locked on the middle distance, went to her, found her, held her. Across all those heads through that closing gap, his eyes found her little tapping hand and her white frightened face, and they fixed on her, and they did not let go. And then his own hand came up. Not flat by his side this time. He brought it up just a few inches, just enough that she could see it over the crowd, and he tapped. Slow, the steady 3. Tap, tap, tap. I see you, I'm here, steady. And I watched that little girl alone in the crush see it. I watched her see his hand, and I watched her do the most extraordinary thing. She stopped the frantic fast tapping, and she made herself do it slow. Tap, 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 matching him, pulling herself by sheer will out of the panic and into the rhythm he'd taught her because he'd told her without a single word across a sea of strangers. That slow was the one. Slow was for when it mattered, and he was doing it with her. She didn't run. She didn't bolt into the crowd where she'd have been truly lost. She stood, because he was standing. She held still in the one spot where her people could find her, because the giant in the fur hat was holding still too, and they were holding still together. That's the thing nobody tells you about that signal. It wasn't just "I'm scared." It was "stay where you are and I'll make sure you're found." He couldn't come to her, so he taught her in that moment to make herself easy to come to plant her feet and tap slow and trust. But Daniel didn't stop at the taps, because the taps were for her, to steady her, to anchor her. They wouldn't fetch help, and help was what she needed fast before the crowd swallowed her up entirely. So here's where the standing his post becomes something more than I ever understood about that job. He was not alone out there. They never are. There's a whole system around those men, a sergeant, an orderly, the box-to-box discipline of the guard. And on a day like that, plainclothes officers folded invisibly into the crowd, the kind of men who look like tourists and are not. The little girl's own protection, the suited men, were part of that web too. And Daniel had a voice. Guards are silent, yes, but not mute. There are words they're permitted in the right moment, in the right voice. Commands, the kind that carry. I heard him. Over the noise of the crowd, in a voice I'd never heard from him, a voice that came up out of his boots and cut through everything, he called out. A short, sharp command. I didn't catch all the words. Something with a name in it, a rank, a direction. The sort of thing that means nothing to a tourist and everything to the men trained to hear it. And he turned his head, which he must never do, a few hard degrees, towards where the plainclothes officers would be. And he called it again, and he flicked his eyes towards the little girl so anyone who knew how to read him would follow his line of sight straight to her. It happened fast after that, faster than I can tell it. A man I'd taken for a tourist, a fellow in a cap who'd been leaning against the railings doing nothing for 10 minutes, which I should have noticed. That's the tell, the ones doing nothing. This man came off the railings like he'd been fired from a gun. He didn't run exactly. He moved. Smooth and quick and certain, cutting through the crowd at an angle, his eyes already on the little girl because he'd followed Daniel's line. The suited man on the phone spun round at the same instant. Somebody had got to him, or he'd heard the command too. And the older woman burst back round the side of the man with the rucksack, and all three of them converged on that one small spot in the crowd where a little girl stood tapping her thumb, slow, 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 exactly where Daniel had held her. The man in the cap reached her first. He didn't grab her or frighten her. He crouched, he got down to her height, which is the thing the giant in the fur hat could never do, and he said something, and he showed her something, a badge maybe, I couldn't see, and the little girl looked at him, and then she looked past him up and over to Daniel's box, checking the way she always checked. And Daniel back at his post now, eyes front, the brief storm of motion already folding back into stillness. Daniel brought his hand down by his side, and he tapped, slow, tap, tap, tap. This one's safe. You can go with this one, I've got you, you're all right. And the little girl let the man in the cap take her hand. The older woman reached her a second later and scooped her up, and the suited man closed in, all apologies and white-faced fright, and the whole careful web of people who were meant to be guarding her gathered her back in, and folded her away into the middle of themselves where she should have been all along. It was over in less than a minute. Most of the crowd never knew anything had happened. Just a child briefly separated and quickly found, the most ordinary thing in the world. They went back to their photographs. But I knew it hadn't been ordinary at all. I knew that a guard who was sworn never to move had, in the space of a minute, turned his head and raised his hand and used his voice and bent every quiet edge of his stillness, without ever once leaving his post, to reach across a crowd and pull a frightened child to safety with nothing but 3 slow taps and a system he trusted to follow his eyes. He stood his post, and because he stood it, she was found. The little girl, as she was carried away in the older woman's arms, did one last thing. She looked back, over the woman's shoulder the way she had that very first time all those visits ago. She found Daniel's box one more time, and she lifted her hand, and she made her fist, and her thumb came up, and she tapped. Slow, the steady 3, tap, tap, tap. Thank you, I'm safe, I knew you'd see. And Daniel, I was watching his face, I'll never forget his face. Daniel kept his eyes front and his body still and his discipline perfect. But that ghost of a smile, that less than a smile I'd first seen given to a pigeon on a gray morning, came up at the corner of his mouth, and it stayed. Longer than I'd ever seen it stay. Then the crowd closed, and she was gone, and he was a statue again, watching the empty middle distance with water-clear eyes, and the morning went on as if nothing in the world had happened. I had to sit down on my little stool after that. My legs had gone. I'd been holding my breath, I think, for the whole of it, and when it let go I sat down hard and I found there were tears on my face, and I couldn't have told you exactly why. I told you I saw Daniel off duty a second time, years later. I'll tell you about it now because it's the last piece, and it's the piece that made me understand what the whole thing had been about. It was a long while after. I'd given up the flower stand by then. The chest got worse. The cold mornings beat me in the end, and I was just an old woman doing her shopping. And I was crossing near the park on a bright autumn day when I saw a man on a bench in civvies, with gray coming into his hair now and the shoulders, and the string pulling him up from the top of his head even sitting down. And I knew him at once. I went over, I said, "You won't remember me, the flower lady from the railings." And he looked up and after a second his whole face opened. "The flower lady," he said, "course I remember you, heaven's sake, you're still about." We talked a while about nothing much. The weather, the years, how it all changes, and then I couldn't help myself. I said, "Can I ask you something about when you were on the boxes? There was a little girl, used to come in the quiet hours, frightened little thing in buckle shoes, and you used to," and I made the fist and I tapped my thumb slow 3 times. And he went very still, stiller than a man sitting on a bench has any right to go, and he looked at me for a long moment. And then he said quiet, "You saw that?" "I saw all of it," I said. 19 years on that pavement, I saw everything. I saw the day in the crowd when she got separated and you." "I shouldn't have turned my head," he said, quick, like it still bothered him, like he'd been carrying it. "Against everything. You're not to break the post, not for anything. I've thought about it 1,000 times." "You didn't break it," I said. "You stood it. You stood it and you saved her. There's a difference and you know there is." He didn't say anything for a bit. He looked out at the park, and then he said something I've kept with me ever since. He said, "You want to know the truth of it. She taught me more than I taught her. I went out on those boxes thinking the job was to be a wall, stand still, give nothing, be a thing they take photos of. And then there's this little girl scared half to death of the whole world looking up at me like I might be the one safe thing in it. And I couldn't be a wall to that. I just couldn't. So I worked out the one thing I could give that wouldn't break the post. 3 taps, slow, steady, you're all right." He smiled, the ghost of it, the same one. "Didn't think anyone would ever see. Didn't matter to me if they did. It mattered that she did. "What happened to her?" I asked. "Do you know, did she?" "She grew up," he said simply. "They do, stopped being frightened of crowds, I should think, stopped needing it." He shrugged. "That's the job, isn't it? You give them the steady, and then they don't need you anymore, and that's the whole point. That's when you've done it right." And then he stood up, and the string pulled him up from the top of his head, and he was tall again, and he said it was good to see me, and he meant it, and he walked off into the bright autumn day. And I stood there by the bench, an old woman with her shopping, and I made a fist without even thinking about it, and my thumb came up and I tapped. Slow. 3 times, for nobody. For the both of them, for all of it. I've thought about what that signal really was in all the years since, and I've decided it was never really about danger, not deep down. It was about being seen. Because that's all fear is mostly in a child or anyone else. It's the feeling that you're alone in the crowd and nobody's watching, and if something goes wrong, there'll be no one. And what he gave her, what those 3 slow taps gave her, wasn't a way to call for help. It was the certainty that she didn't have to. The certainty that even when he stared straight ahead and never moved and gave the whole world nothing, he was watching. He always saw her. 3 taps meant I see you, and a child who knows she's seen is a child who can be brave. He couldn't crouch down to her. He couldn't take her hand or carry her or chase off the things that frightened her. He was bound by his post, by his oath, by a stillness he'd sworn never to break. He had less freedom to help that little girl than any other grown-up in all of London. And he helped her more than any of them. That's the thing I've carried all these years, from a flower stand by the railings. The biggest kindnesses don't always come from the people with the most freedom to give them. Sometimes they come from the one who's pinned in place, who's got nothing to offer but a thumb and 3 slow taps, and who gives it anyway quietly, asking nothing, expecting no one to ever know. So if you ever stand in that crowd, in the heat and the noise and the press of all those strangers, and you look up at one of those still men in the tall black hats, and think there's nobody home behind that face, look again. Look at the hands. You never know what small kindness is being held there, perfectly still, waiting for the one person who needs to see it. I saw it once, for the length of a spring and a summer and one bright autumn afternoon on a bench. And I'll tell you what the little girl knew, looking up at her giant in the fur hat. He never moved, but he never once looked away.